Hello, my name is Gabriel Mullen, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. The Dole Student Advisory Board is comprised of KU students committed to the bipartisan mission of the Dole Institute. Members of the SAB receive many great opportunities. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. We would like to encourage each of you to get special benefits and support the Dole Institute by becoming a friend of the Dole Institute. If you enjoyed this evening's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Hearing assistance is available, and we have a loop seating section at each program designated by a sign. If you have any questions about the loop, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers. Before we begin tonight, I would like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student helper with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. And now, please welcome Dr. Barbara Ballard.
Good evening and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics and the 2018 Journalism and Politics Lecture. Many of you know that this is our first fall semester evening program. We're so glad that you chose to attend. As you said, I'm Barbara Ballard. I'm the Associate Director here at the Dole Institute of Politics. Before introducing tonight's guest, however, I would like to ask you to join us in a moment of silence as we mark the 17th anniversary of the attacks of September 11, 2001. On this day, let us remember those who we have lost and honor their memory. Thank you. At the back of this hall, which many of you know as Hanson Hall, and flanking the largest stained glass American flag window are two columns salvaged from Tower 1 of the World Trade Center at Ground Zero. Often people will come in here and sometimes not notice the two 10-foot beams, but they notice the American flag, which, as I told you, was the largest stained glass American flag window in the world. These columns were presented to Senator Dole, Bob Dole, in appreciation for his work with President Bill Clinton on the Families of Freedom Scholarship Fund for the children of 9/11 victims. To learn more about these columns, you may find informational handouts near the entrance to the building. This evening's interview will be conducted by Dole Institute Director Bill Lacey. Our guests tonight cover Kansas politics for news organizations across the state. Mary Clarkin is a reporter for the Hutchinson News. Jim McLean is managing editor of the Kansas News Service. Caroline Sweeney is a reporter for KCTV 5. And Hunter Woodall is a political reporter for the Kansas City Star. We're all interested in Kansas politics. I'll turn it over to Bill Lacey, and ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel for the 2018 Journalism and Politics Lecture.
Thank you all for coming out tonight, and we really appreciate your support of this program. And you might want to check out our fall schedule because we'll be doing lots of interesting stuff this fall, and we'll be having both a Kansas and national post-election conference. They'll occur, the Kansas post-election conference in November and the national one in early December. And those are some of the best programs we do here, so we hope you can join us for those. I'd like to start tonight with a question, and we'll start with Mary, and we'll go down the row on the first question. Tell us how you decided, Mary, and then Jim and everybody else, to get into journalism.
I grew up in a family that subscribed to the morning paper, the evening paper, and the small town weekly newspaper. And then I was in college when Watergate happened and watched the Watergate hearings. I don't know if I've read every Bob Woodward book, but it's possible. And so I was hooked early on.
For me, it was just pretty much serendipity. I didn't know what I was going to do, and I got a job at a radio station in Parsons, Kansas. It's kind of the Les Nessman story, you know.
I've never thought of you and Les Nessman at the same time, Jim.
Well, that's what I picture in my own mind when I think of myself. Whatever the Golden Hog or the Golden Acorn Award or whatever it was. But interesting that Mary should say what she said, because I'm looking over at that picture of the Watergate Hotel over there, and I was in high school, maybe a freshman in college, and I remember being riveted to the television set watching those hearings as well. And it just occurred to me that I knew that I couldn't do a lot of different things that I might have wanted to do, but I thought I could do this because I always looked at journalism as kind of a real public service. And that's the way I pursued it ever since I started, and I just feel like every time I'm on the radio or writing or everything else, I'm just trying to think about all you people out there consuming it and just trying to do the best job I can letting you know what's going on.
Yeah. So I don't have like a kickoff story, but I was lucky enough to have family that supported my writing and was deeply invested in my curiosity. And my father kind of pointed me in the direction of journalism, and then my college roommate worked at the Kansas State Collegian, and she drug me into the Collegian newsroom one day, and I had known instantly that I found my people and found my calling, and I kind of dove headfirst into that. And there were so many events from when I was in high school, including September 11th, where I was fascinated and wanted to know more and turned to the journalists of our time to learn more. And that just continued to fuel me toward the professional career that I have now.
So my journey is a bit twofold. I was raised in Alexandria, Virginia by a single mother who's just about the strongest person in the world that I know. She's a public school librarian in Virginia, and she just let me read everything and anything when I was a kid. So obviously, growing up just outside D.C., I was fascinated. I went to the second Bush inauguration. I went to the first Obama inauguration, and was just swept up in it. But also, my grandparents they read the Washington Post every day, same as my mother, so I would wake up with the Washington Post every day. And my grandfather, retired Navy guy, 30 years, very committed to public service. He got me into writing. He actually, when I was a kid, he let me write a short story with him, so I actually got my start in writing in fiction, oddly enough. And yeah, no fake news, I promise. But I got my start. I dictated a short story to him, and I was in 5th grade, and he showed up in my classroom, and he showed me, a story told by Hunter Woodall to Jim Harkin, and I saw my byline for the first time, and I was a sucker ever since.
Oh, some very good stories. I want to start with a question about how you approach your craft, okay? Rather than jumping into the campaign, we'll do that on the next one. What have you been doing to cover the midterm elections? And what does your average day look like when you're out on the trail covering the elections? It's whoever wants to jump first.
Yeah, I'll start. So for television, especially in an age where we can all get news 24 hours a day, what I've been trying to focus on, especially over the last several weeks, is how do I strike an appropriate balance between giving our viewers in Kansas City the news that they need to know, but not oversaturating them or overburdening them when they have a limited amount of time to actually sit down and tune in to our newscasts. I also know that not everyone is like us in this room, and politics might not fascinate them as much as it does me or my producers and the managers in our newsroom. So I have to be very aware that the news of the day may not be politics. So for the last month, I've been trying to come up with a plan to succinctly cover the races that we've decided our viewers need to keep an eye on, and planning things out so that in case something comes up, we have some breathing room to cover that breaking political news. And if it's been a few days since we've heard from that candidate, I have them available to tap into.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think you've assembled a good team, good panel here, because I think we all approach this differently. I remember when I was working for a daily newspaper, I mean, there wasn't really any development in a campaign that was too small to write 40 inches about. You just did it. But now, I'm in public radio, so there is no other news other than public affairs and politics.
Of course.
It's our proverbial bread and butter. But we're trying to then approach it on multiple platforms, if you will. Where there's a real emphasis in public radio now from NPR on down, an emphasis on the digital stuff, the online, what essentially is an online version of newspaper stories. So we're trying to get better at that, and we're working with a lot of radio reporters who've been radio reporters and having to bring them along in that regard. But we've decided we're going to do one weekly conversation every week, a kind of a roundtable of reporters like NPR does, just to catch up on the smaller things that are developing in the campaign so we don't miss any of those things, and also then don't have to blow them out of proportion in any way. And then one thing I'll do a little proselytizing here. We've been working on a new podcast called My Fellow Kansans that debuts on September the 17th, and we'll do a weekly update right on through Election Day. And the whole point of that is to try to get deeper into Kansas politics. The first episode, we literally get into the DNA of Kansas politics, and we spend a lot of time talking about Bob Dole, among other people, and try to talk a little bit about where Kansas has been in its history, where we have come to at this point, and why we're here rather than someplace else.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll just say my colleagues here are a lot more strategic than I am. Every day, especially, so I'm the Kansas State House reporter for the Star, so essentially since January, the start of the session, I kind of feel like I've been running a marathon race at a 200-meter pace. It's just, I wake up every morning to, if the president has tweeted a lot, I get all the tweets sent to my phone, so I don't need an alarm clock anymore. And it's essentially, there's so much going on at once. You could really be drowning in news right now. So for example, today I had a story published that showed only 58% of Republicans in the legislature who are going to be on the ballot in the fall and in the state Senate support Chris Kobach's nomination for governor. And by 7:30 in the morning, I was already getting angry text messages from a state representative about the story. People are just, I think it's that balance of, you need to keep going, but you also need to make sure how your stories are resonating. And just when you talk about, so again, I'm a political reporter. I wrote mostly political stories, but the nice thing is, again, I'm a nerd. I'm a huge political nerd. And I go back to, okay, I listen to a story. This matters to me because I'm a little bit wonky, but I think back to my family. Okay, if, when my mom, when my grandparents want to read this story, does it interest, your average reader? And that's kind of how I always maintain my perspective. In an election like this, with so much going on, I think it's crucial just to think, okay, how does this relate to just, people on the street, people that you know? Is it more than just yourself?
And Bill, I hope this is okay, but Hunter, I guarantee you that prior to the primary, there wouldn't have been 58%. I'm serious.
Yeah.
That we could talk about that dynamic.
Yeah. And as a reporter at a small regional paper, I also cover education. So politics and government will not be something I do on a daily basis. And I will say also that it kind of depends on where you're at. And in Hutchinson, there's only going to be one contested Kansas House race. And so different areas of the state will have more races going on than Western Kansas for sure.
Okay. I'd like all of you to comment on what you think some of the key state issues are, in the gubernatorial race, but also the legislative races.
So, I covered the first gubernatorial debate last Wednesday in Overland Park. Obviously, there was a state fair debate on Saturday. It was interesting. There's kind of been, in the governor's race, a relitigation of the Sam Brownback tax cuts. Is Chris Kobach, he wants to roll back the 2017 tax increase, that essentially ended Brownback's tax cuts.
He also wants to, roll back the sales tax increase of 2015, and he wants to change how they appraise homes. And that would, if without cutting, that could really crater the budget. And you have Laura Kelly on the other end who does not want that to happen. So, and of course, Greg Orman has kind of maintained more of that side of, I'm not a member of both parties. I'm not a member of either party. Both parties have really done a poor job running the state. So on the state level, it's kind of become a relitigation of Sam Brownback, oddly enough, even though he's long gone and in D.C. at this point. And I didn't think Sam Brownback would be so relevant in a state race at this point.
I think I can, I go to sleep every night with this like mantra in my head: school funding, taxes, healthcare. School funding, taxes, healthcare. Because those are the three big talkers that I hear from candidates and from citizens. So are the candidates getting it from the citizens, or are the citizens getting the rhetoric from the candidates? But it's, taxes, school funding, healthcare. And then the other one that keeps coming up, especially now after what happened in Johnson County with the vote totaling issues. A lot of people are concerned about their voting rights and if their votes are being counted, and the access to proper voting machines and voting outlets. So I've started to hear that come around over the last several weeks too.
Yeah, I think one of the big issues is going to be, whether you're talking about taxes, the budget, spending, anything else, you hear Greg Orman talk, and all the candidates are addressing this to some degree or another. It's, what is Kansas going to be in 20 years? What is Kansas going to be in 30 years? And, you're not going to get a lot of long-term thinking in campaign rhetoric. And let's face it, a lot of this is style over substance. I mean, if you look at, and this isn't a criticism, if you look at Chris Kobach, he's got kind of a mantra, he's got kind of a script, and he's going to, and what people like about him is it doesn't vary, okay? He just says the same thing over and over again. People can come at him all they want, and he's just going to say it over and over again. And yet, if you dig underneath that a little bit, I mean, he does talk about revisiting the tax cuts. He says the one mistake that Sam Brownback made was that he didn't cut spending before he cut taxes. And it's a nice rhetorical line, but if you press him on it and you say, okay, you're going to cut spending, then you're going to cut taxes, how are you going to cut spending? And his comeback on that is, I've cut the budget in the Secretary of State's office, which is like a pittance compared to the state government. And he says, we're going to do it through attrition. We're just going to let people leave, and we're not going to hire their replacements. Well, I think Kansans, frankly, have seen a lot of that over the last 8 years in terms of offices closing all over the state, social welfare offices over the state. Counties are going from one place where you can go get your driver's license renewed to, from 2 to 1. So we'll see how that works over time, but that's his answer on that. On the other hand, Greg Orman the other day very pointedly to Laura Kelly criticized her. She's going to revitalize the transportation plan, but she's not saying how she's going to pay for it, right? So, par for the course in terms of campaigns. But you guys are right in the sense that Kobach is a continuation. We're headed for the right, red or red state if Kobach's elected. Kelly wants a stasis point in the middle, and I think Orman certainly is nearer Kelly than he is Kobach, but he's trying very hard to identify the differences between them.
Yeah.
And this Saturday at the Kansas State Fair in Hutchinson, they had a venue where politicians literally got up on a tree stump and spoke for 10 minutes and took questions. Too. Right. And the question that people were asked, that the politicians were asked the most, and it wasn't by the same person, different people, medical marijuana.
Yeah.
That was the issue. And then, and they didn't necessarily like what they heard from the stock answer seemed to be that, Attorney General Derek Schmidt said he liked the law as it is now. Right. And that got a boo. Yeah. So, but also the candidates, the issue that they spoke on more than education was Medicaid expansion. So they hit that more than school spending.
One thing that I did realize at the state fair, and it's good for especially reporters like Hunter and myself who are in a big metro on the eastern side of a very agrarian, large, sweeping plain state, is that there is a large voter base in agriculture and farming, and those weren't topics that were touched on, if I can remember correctly, in the Wednesday debate, but at the state fair there were several questions about farming and agriculture, and it's good for us to remember that in the metro, because that, even though Kansas City is metropolitan, right outside Kansas City, even right outside of Lawrence, we see agriculture, business, big and small. So that, I think, will become part of the candidate rhetoric soon.
And Bill, that was an interesting thing, because that used to be known as the ag debate at the Farm Bureau debate at the State Fair, and immigration was an issue in that debate and in the context of agriculture. And it's going to be interesting to see what the Farm Bureau does with its endorsement. They endorsed Collier in the primary. They're going to have a real tough time picking, I think, in the general, and may not endorse, because immigrant labor is so vitally important to farmers in western Kansas, and they're not sure they like Chris Kobach's position on that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Hunter said something a few moments ago that I thought was very important about his being a political nerd. So I just want to take a poll right now. How many of us are political nerds or political junkies? Okay. Looks like the vast majority qualify. So
Otherwise, why would they be here?
yeah, why would they be here? But I asked that question to set up the next question that I want to hear you guys talk about. You know, what are the factors that you see today that are going to decide the outcome of these midterm elections in Kansas? You know, typically we look at partisan ID as being, and presidential job approval doesn't affect, you know, localized races as much, but it still has some kind of effect. But beyond those traditional big factors in a midterm, what do you think are going to be the big factors that you're going to look to on election day to kind of read the tea leaves?
Yeah, we're all mulling this.
Is Patrick Miller still here? Let's have him
Yeah,
up.
where is he?
Well, going back to the State Fair on Saturday when they had the governor's debate, and right before it was over, I was walking back through the fairgrounds, going through some of the buildings, and they were packed. So people who could have watched Kobach and Kelly and Orman on stage, just a matter of yards away, weren't. And they were all ages. So I'm not sure what that tells you, but it could be a lower turnout despite all the heat that will be on the campaign trail.
I think Mary's going in an interesting direction with her comment. For me, what I'm finding when I'm out speaking to just Kansas Cityans is apathy is going to, they're just apathetic to what's kind of going around them, despite our best efforts to try and shake them up and get them kind of rallied behind anyone, anything, to get them energized. I think the oversaturation of news and trying to muddle through sometimes what's happening around them on social media and what they're hearing from sources even in their own neighborhoods, that's really going to play a role. And that's what's always been the issue with midterms. We see time and time again, it's the base that goes and votes in these midterms, the very dedicated base. And that's what you were seeing at the state fair. The people that were in the shirts and yelling at the candidates and riling everyone up, that's the base. So I think that there is a concern that apathy may play a role, despite the fact we're hearing of more and more people running for office and more people wanting to talk about politics. It matters on that day if you go and vote.
You know, I don't know about that, because we see increasingly in recent years, politics at this level is getting nationalized to such a huge degree. And given what we see going on in Washington and the divide in the country, and you see voters being energized all over the country, particularly in congressional races, because and so let's think a little bit about what happened in the 3rd District. Why Sharice Davids won that primary in the 3rd District, and think about what was driving voter turnout over there. And again, I think there's some some national phenomena at work there. And so I think that there's energy at that level in terms of particularly those congressional races. The 2nd District race, I think, is going to be fascinating.
I do too.
Paul Davis, who won that district in the race that he lost to Sam Brownback, even though Trump carried it significantly. And you have the 3rd District, which Hillary Clinton won by a mere percentage point,
1%.
right? And so I think that there's a great deal of interest in those races. And then the question is, I think in the governor's race, Kobach has a solid base, there's no doubt about that. And he's going to retain that base much in the same way that President Trump retains his base. And the question then is, I think the big question to answer in this race, because we have that third candidate, Greg Orman, he is a very comfortable point for a moderate Republican to end up. He's a refuge for moderate Republicans who can't bring themselves to vote for a Democrat. You have plenty of people out there who I think, frankly, fear a Kobach governorship if they're moderate. Well,
Jim's thinking way into the future.
I was skipping ahead because we all know that's where he's headed. But seriously, I think that there's that kind of fear factor, given what Hunter was talking about, the Brownback legacy. And so what are they going to do? What are those moderate Republicans in the unaffiliated? First of all, can unaffiliated voters, can anybody motivate them to come out? And where are the moderate Republicans going to end up? I think that's the thing to be watching on election night.
Well, and I will say, I think it's interesting. I go out and I cover protests, I cover rallies, and I also, a big thing I did in 2016 was, I like going out, obviously, with politicians, lawmakers to events where they're interacting with constituents.
Yep.
And if people won't let me come out with them, and there's one campaign, a Democrat campaign in the 3rd District, who would not let me come out with them and kind of talk to voters with them. So I started going and canvassing. I would knock on doors where there was a sign for Jay Seidy, Kevin Yoder's Democratic challenger, and I would say, why are you supporting Jay Seidy? And more often than not was, well, he's a Democrat. There was nothing about him that they really were voting for. And to me, 2016, in terms of those House races, was very apathetic. When I've covered, even in the early stages, 2018, in the 2nd congressional and the 3rd in the governor's race, I'm not seeing apathy. I mean, I've been covering rallies where I feel like people who have never gotten out are out there, and it seems like they're fighting for their lives almost. I mean, whether it comes to immigration or healthcare. I mean, again, I've only been doing this for about 5 years now, but they are so passionate, and that wasn't something I saw in 2016 as much. Now, of course, in the 2nd and the 3rd, there are candidates on both sides. I think there's a lot of passion for those candidates. The governor's race, I mean, Chris Kobach, when you talk to people that support him, they will bash through a wall for him. They adore him, and that's the thing that when you look at Orman and Kelly, do they have that same thing? Because as you saw in 2016, somebody's saying, well, I can't vote for this person, so I guess I'll vote for this person. That doesn't really get you elected.
But I have the ability, or not the ability, I get the chance to talk to people outside of the political circle when I'm not covering political stories who know that I also cover politics, so they want to talk about it. So I think what both Jim and Hunter are saying is true, that there are more people engaging, but I am just, normal Joe Coffee in line with me at Quick Trip. They don't have this kind of, the drive to go out there. They're still trying to figure out what they want to do. And some of them are just like, well, I just kind of want to stay out of it.
Okay. Speak, if all of you would, speak to, and I want to ask a specific question about the Republican Party and then about the third party candidate that Jim mentioned. The Republican side, how split is the party? Not only just between Collier and Kobach, but also between moderates and conservatives. And how problematic is that for Chris Kobach?
Well, Hunter?
I had a big story on this today, actually, so thank you for that question. This took way too much work, so I don't know if I'll do it again, but I contacted every sitting GOP lawmaker in the House, in the Kansas House, and then every state senator, did the same for the Democrats, and said, are you going to support your party's nominee? So that was about 140 people I ended up contacting if they hadn't given endorsements yet. And the Democrats were fairly easy. About 94% said they would support Laura Kelly, the Democratic candidate for governor. I believe one wouldn't say, and then two wouldn't get back to me. On the Kobach side, I spent about 3 weeks either emailing, calling, and really just bugging the heck out of people to get them, which I like doing. It's kind of fun bothering people. And what I found was, after really making those calls time and time again, was, again, 58% of lawmakers say they'll support Kobach, and I believe 28% wouldn't say, and they actually, some of them grew really frustrated when I called, like, how dare you ask how I'm going to vote? Right. And I thought, you're an elected official. I mean, I can ask you, this is well within my rights to ask you this. And then I believe it was about close to 10% just did not get back to me, and that was a good amount of moderates who just didn't want to say. And so it was about 39% or so, close to 38, 39, close to 40, who would not say whether or not they supported Kobach. And if you're seeing in that division in the GOP itself, I mean, you have to think that goes down to voters. Because, I mean, these are lawmakers who will have to work with Kobach, presumably, and they're evenly split. And I was fascinated by that. And we've seen, really since, for years, there's a large, there's that moderate faction of the GOP and there's that conservative faction. And I used to cover Missouri politics and Wyoming politics. Obviously, there's large Republican parties in those states. They don't have these same divisions. And Kansas has a very emboldened moderate party, very critical conservative party. I mean, when I asked a lawmaker on the conservative side how he felt about moderates not endorsing or not saying they support Kobach, I mean, I'm quoting him. I think he said, his quote was, they have no balls, no guts. That was his attitude. So you kind of see the fire in between those two groups.
I've got a couple names I'll throw out to illustrate how deep the divide is, I think. Barbara Boyer, for one, state senator from Mission Hills, who had the audacity to endorse a Democrat in the primary in the 3rd District congressional race, and she was then excommunicated from her committees in the legislature. And then Bill Graves. I mean, I talked to Bill Graves for an hour the other day. It's funny, I got an interview with him after he came out and endorsed Laura Kelly. And Bill Graves, again, is the embodiment of moderate Republicanism, right? Very nice man, and I called him up and he was home, and I asked him how much time he had for the interview, and he said, well, we have 2 homes now, and Linda's in Florida with the horses, so how much time do you need? A couple hours? and he couldn't have been nicer, but I got an opportunity to really talk to him, and it was really clear to me in that conversation, what a struggle this was for him to do it, but how deeply he felt about what he was doing, because that split is pronounced. It has been. That tug of war has been going on for 30 years, and it ebbs and flows, but I think the divide is pretty deep right now. And again, that's why I think this Greg Orman candidacy is so important, because I talked to a guy like Ed Flengy. People know who Ed is, and he writes the column, and again, he doesn't know who he's going to vote for, but we had a conversation about it, and a guy like Greg Orman appeals to him, and I think that's true for a lot of people who just aren't comfortable crossing the partisan line.
Well, Hunter made a comment about, are we going to start seeing this divide kind of translate into voters? And I say, I think we're seeing it already. Just look at the Republican votes from the primary. 350 votes between 343. I rounded 343.
Well, Jeff and Chris were counting. I guarantee you that.
343 votes separating the sitting governor and the Secretary of State, and then. But what fascinates me the most when you want to talk about how the moderates are feeling is when you look at the Ken Selzer and Jim Barnett votes. All I want to do is talk to people about Jim Barnett and Ken Selzer and those votes, because I think we were so fascinated by this very slim margin, and that's what a lot of people were talking about, but it became slim for several reasons, and one of those reasons was a self-proclaimed centrist named Jim Barnett. And I think he spoke to a lot of people, and he was palatable to a lot of these moderates that are like, I don't know how I feel about our sitting governor and this firebrand Republican. I like Jim Barnett, and I'm going to put my vote behind him. And I think they are the ones that really show the schism in the Republican Party. 4th
episode of the podcast, The Red Pickup Truck. It's all about Jim Barnett and his campaign for governor.
Hutchinson had a very fiercely fought Kansas House race between moderate Republican Representative Steve Becker and conservative Republican Paul Wagner. And it ended up being Wagner won by 9 votes. But it got to the point where if you would go to a county Republican Party sponsored debate or meeting, you'd really only see the conservative Republicans there. So it's that the division is there and probably just grows deeper in an election year, but it's long-lasting.
And those folks who live in Lawrence know Scott Morgan, who ran for Congress, he ran for Secretary of State. Again, moderate Republican, he's now trying to form a new political party because he just doesn't feel like the Republican Party is home to him anymore.
That sets up my next question perfectly, Jim. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We've had here at the Dole Institute in the last semester, and I hope some of you were able to catch the programs that Jim Jonas led, our discussion groups. Jim is a national strategist who was associated with the Kobach campaign in 2014, and also Reed Galen, who is someone I know real well, who's the son of Rich Galen, who I worked with at the National Republican Congressional Committee on Fred Thompson's presidential campaign in 2008. And they have really devoted, there's an effort out there to build an independent movement now.
Right.
So this is my question about Greg Orman. Does he have, in your opinion, a legitimate chance to win, or is he a spoiler who's going to make it a three-way race and let Kobach basically win on his base vote?
The polls don't suggest that Orman has that strong of a chance, but it's still early. And kind of like you said, the moderate Republicans have to go somewhere, and that might be where they end up.
You know, I wish I had obviously I don't have an answer for that question now. He's going to have plenty of money. He looked like he belonged on the stage at the State Fair debate. He wasn't outclassed in any way, shape, or form. I know Patrick Miller's still here, the political scientist. Look at Joyce. I mean, there are a lot of people here who know this stuff better than I do. I think what the conventional wisdom is, Bill, to be pretty clear about it, is if he starts creeping up into the 11, 12, 13, even up to 15% range, that's really bad news for Laura Kelly if he gets that many votes, right? Does he have a path to victory? Most people who study politics and know it well say no. He doesn't have. You can't convince him of that, and that's as it should be. He's running for governor. He's on the line. He's out there campaigning, and he's decided he thinks he can win. A lot of observers, the pundits, do not think he can win, but they think it's very likely, should he catch any support at all and gets up into that 15% range, that could do exactly what you say and tilt the race to Kobach.
My answer is very similar to Jim's. Today, I was asked twice what I think Greg Orman is going to do in this election, and I just want to see how it's going to play out, because I think that's really the only way we're going to know what a strong independent candidate like Greg Orman would do in a statewide election, because he is a strong candidate. He did give Senator Roberts a tough race, and overlooking that, just looking at him as a third-party candidate, I think is detrimental to the role he's going to play in this election.
Well, of course, so you look at 2014, the Democrats, cleared the path for him. They essentially, he became the de facto Democratic candidate in a number of ways. Mm-hmm. I think the key thing here is you have candidates, and I know we've all heard this over the years, that say like, oh, I'm not beholden to one party. I'm my own person. I'm a free thinker, independent thinker. To win a campaign, you really do need that party infrastructure, because you need people to turn out the votes in these counties. Like if you're Greg Orman and John Dole, as lieutenant governor candidate, how are you going to turn out votes in western Kansas? I mean, you have political parties who have spent decades upon decades working on their turnout the vote ways. They know that they have that infrastructure in place, and that's the tough part with an independent. I mean, can you be an independent and just become governor in a state like Kansas? I'm not sure if that's possible, because you almost need this to go from the bottom bar. Like you're winning city council seats, you're doing something like that, building this through the community. That infrastructure isn't there. I mean, if you want to go talk to a local club or something, a local party, meeting, Chris Kobach can just call up that local Republican in that county and say, hey, I want to go speak to them. What does Greg Orman do? And I think that's going to matter come election time, because you can get this much face time, but you need to reach the voters who are actually going to vote. Can Greg Orman do that? I'm not sure. And
Hunter, to your point, that's again, there's a difference between an independent candidate. Whoops, that was nice. Difference between an independent candidate like Greg Orman and what Scott's trying to do, which is to create that party apparatus behind somebody who's not either a Republican or Democrat. Because he looked at that and didn't think that you could win unless you had that base of support underneath you there.
Right. Okay, we're going to get down to the tough questions now.
Oh.
Could I get the four of you to just share, as of today, understanding that we're still, almost 2 months out from the election, we probably are, how would you handicap the gubernatorial election and the second and third congressional races? How serious are each of them? And you don't have to say so-and-so's going to win. I'm trying to buy you a little bit of space here, but I don't want to put you too much on the spot, because you're all kind enough to come to the Dole Institute. But give us your thoughts. What are the key factors that are going to decide a race, in your opinion, or something like that?
Well, I'll start. I'm going to beg off the second and the third because our paper covers 2 congressional districts, the 1st and the 4th.
Okay.
So I don't. But the congressional race, I think Kobach, no matter what might come out, like when you get closer to the election, the information that might come out damaging about any of the candidates, and I think he's, with his base, he's got a firewall. So he's safe from that. I don't know if Kelly or Orman enjoy that same safety net if something negative were to come out.
So you asked us how serious these races were, and so I'm going to kind of point toward that direction because Jim made a comment earlier, and I think we all know this as people who are tapped into politics, but also as just Kansans and Americans. There's really no pure, true, local-only, state-only elections anymore. There's this massive trickle-down effect from national to state to local, from state to local, from even like, local elections, these small city council elections that we're all looking at on these ballots. I think we have to look at each race as a very serious race because the way the voters take these races is serious because they will impact their day-to-day lives. I think for me, I will just say the most fascinating race for me outside of the gubernatorial race is this Kansas 3rd race. Mm-hmm. I'm deeply fascinated by Sharice Davids as a candidate. I'm incredibly curious to see how Kevin Yoder continues. We saw him immediately hit back the day after the election with some advertising against her. And we all I was kind of thinking that it was going to be difficult for him to find another toehold, and he did with that podcast interview she did. Mm-hmm. So that's the race I'm most fascinated by outside of the gubernatorial race. But I think all of these races are extremely serious, and we have to look at them through that lens.
I think we're in such uncharted territory. Again, I take my thinking derives somewhat from looking at what's happening across the country where there have been so many surprises, right? So we're in a different kind of year this year. And so normally, conventional thinking, again, particularly let's take the 3rd district as an example. Conventional thinking is that, Yoder is a skilled politician. He's got an awful lot of money. And he is very good at ending up where he thinks he needs to be, And that's not a clear anymore blue or red district. It's kind of split right down the middle as evidenced by the last presidential race. So conventional thinking is that, people coming in and saying, you got to nominate a guy like Neerman, who's more centrist. He's one of those centrist Democrats who people will be comfortable voting for. But again, what you're seeing nationally suggests no. Guys like that don't create the energy you need. So there's an insurgency going on out there. I think you're right. I mean, the question is, does Sharice Davids catch that wave? Mm-hmm. I think that's the question. I think it's an open question right now. I don't know. But I think potentially, we're Kansas. It's a red state. And I don't know much about the Thompson-Estes race down in Wichita. I'm not counting that. But potentially 2 districts in the state are in play for Democrats to win, the 3rd and the 2nd. I think if I had to bet right now, I would bet Paul Davis wins the 2nd district because you had every county chair in the 2nd district, the Republican county chairs, come out against Watkins in the final week of the primary. And they can say they're united behind him now, but really? Really? Yeah. I mean, that's a heck of a lot of fence mending that he's got to do, I think, to create the energy you need to win a campaign. They'll sign something and they'll say, yeah, we're all united, but will they work for him? Really, nobody knows much about him. And so I think the 2nd district is truly in play. The 3rd district is a fascinating question. And then that governor's race, I'll just keep saying it. If the Laura Kelly who showed up on the state fair debate stage, if you can keep that energy going through the campaign, I think I saw a real difference in her. I think she's got a chance. I think in a head-to-head race, if it were just Kelly and Kobach, I'd put my money on Kelly right now. But the Orman factor is confounding.
So I need to choose my words carefully here, as I can just feel my phone ringing with mad politicians yelling at me.
That's why you don't.
But you're in your living room here talking to me.
So I think if you're somebody living in Kansas and you want to spend the next decade living here, I think this is the most important election of your lifetime, frankly. Because in the same way, when you look at, you had, President Obama, his legacy, how, Hillary Clinton could kind of, she could kind of crystallize it for him if she had won, in terms of the Affordable Care Act, everything like that. If Kobach wins, you are, in essence, really crystallizing the Sam Brownback legacy, because not all of the same policies, but they do support a lot of those same policies, which if somebody like Laura Kelly or even Greg Orman gets elected, that might, that could really shift. So again, this is an incredibly important election. This could define Kansas for decades, because when you look at the changes done by the Brownback administration, if you do want those changed back to how they were before him under Sebelius or Parkinson, that might take some time. That's not what you're really going to get under Kobach. In that race, I really can't predict. I will say Kobach and Kelly are two of the most dynamic lawmakers I've ever covered. I've seen Kelly tear into administration officials in the Brownback administration in hearings, almost bring one to tears. Kobach, and I will give Chris credit for this. If I ask him a question, he does tell us what he feels. When I would ask, so I asked every candidate in the primary field if they supported, an assault, on certain guns, for people, banning guns for people until they were 21. And Collier really hedged his answer and didn't really want to get back to me. Kobach tells you how he feels, and that is the one thing. He will tell you how he feels. So if Kobach is elected by Kansas, people know what they're getting.
Yeah.
And not only that, he's got stage presence.
He does.
Oh, absolutely.
And he was on the stage at the State Fair debate taking on Kelly, Orman, and the crowd.
Yes. Yes.
No, he was, and he looked like he was having fun.
Mm-hmm. He revels in this. I mean, he always has. And then I kind of share the interest in the second and the third. Obviously, I'm covering both races for the Star. And in the third with Sharice Davids and Kevin Yoder, I mean, Sharice Davids is by far the most interesting candidate, competitor Yoder's had since he won office back in 2010. I really don't know how that race shakes out. Again, I once had an editor comment, Yoder really has a district wired, he thought Yoder would win. This, of course, back in 16. And Yoder still has that same enthusiasm, I think, amongst Republicans. If I were to poll Republican elected officials in that district, I don't think they would be jumping off the ship from Yoder as much as they are from, say, Kobach. For example, Barbara Boyer, that Mission Hills Republican senator who said she was supporting Kelly and then the Democrat against Yoder, that's a rarity. So I really don't know how that race turns out. And I'm actually really fascinated by the second. I mean, you have national Democrats who seem to be chomping at the bit thinking, we're going to win the third. It's a district Hillary Clinton won by 1 point over Trump. We can win this. In the second district, I mean, Paul Davis is probably, at this point, one of the better Democratic candidates in the state. He clearly showed statewide appeal in the governor's race, even though he lost. And he's going up against somebody, like folks have said. I mean, I've talked to Republicans who ran against him who are still kind of venting their frustrations about Steve Watkins winning that primary. So there's a lot of bruises still, and I'm just not quite sure how that's going to shake out come November.
Just one more thing. Hunter was talking about the significance of this election in terms of who's elected governor. And from the primary, there's the clear vision now that the next legislature is going to be a little more conservative than the one in office now. So if it's Kobach as governor, you might see a legislature that then becomes defensive, try to counter what he does. Or if it's Kelly, you could see the moderate Republicans and the Democrats who don't currently have a leader in that governor's seat, suddenly they now have a leader who's governor.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We focused tonight on the gubernatorial race and on the second and third congressional race, and I think everybody pretty much agrees that those need to be observed and they're serious. Are there any other statewide or legislative elections that you have covered individually that you find interesting, and why?
I'm actually, at 6 o'clock tonight, we ran a piece, and we'll be running one longer in one of our hour-long political specials coming up in October about the Democratic candidate in the 15th district in Olathe. His name is Chris Hallmark, and he's the only deaf candidate in the race. And if he were to be elected, he would be the first deaf representative in the legislature. And I found him deeply fascinating in the way he runs his campaign and how he interacts with people when he's out canvassing. So in Olathe, you cannot canvass during the day, during the week. So he primarily canvasses on the weekends. He does have an interpreter team that he uses at events, but when he goes and door knocks, his interpreter stays at the curb. So it's this man who's trying to convey his message in this very simple, kind of passionate way, trying to just interact with people. And it was really interesting to watch from my perspective, to just see how receptive people were. So that, I think, to me is an interesting race, just because there's something totally different about it. And if he is elected, not only would he be the first in the legislature, but he would also be the highest elected official who is deaf. There's one more, and they are the mayor of a small town in California. That's what Chris was telling me. So I find that to be really fascinating from a human interest angle.
Mm-hmm. Other
Well, I think
especially interesting
Secretary of
races?
State's race is going to be fascinating because, I mean, Chris Kobach transformed that office. He created he made it into a platform that he gained national attention, and so excuse, I raised the race with Bam. All I can remember is Bam. His last name is McClendon. He's an interesting guy. You know, the tech industry experience and so forth, and he's got some. For instance, one of the things he wants to do is to go back to electing election officers in the state's largest counties versus having them appointed by the Secretary of State, which I think, in the scheme of things, is a really interesting issue to be talking about. And Scott Schwab, of course, a legislator, longtime legislator, running on the Republican side, won the Republican nomination. And I think that's going to be an interesting race, given, again, the higher profile of that office since Chris Kobach occupied it. And then just very generally, I'm not going to cite a specific legislative race, but I think the legislative races in general, for reasons that Mary said, are going to be fascinating to see how much, if any, of a ideological shift we end up with at the end of the day there.
There are two districts in Johnson County, Republican districts, that in 2016 Democrats won, and the representatives are Representative Brett Parker and Representative Cindy Holscher. And those are tough seats. Now, the funny thing is, Democrats have often had this problem of, like a thin bench of, kind of rising young stars. Holscher and Parker they were, first-time reps in the 2017, 2018 sessions, really made an impact. And they were very vocal, liberal, proud candidates in districts that really, I would say are more moderate to red. And, they're on the ballot, and Brett Parker's running against the state rep he actually ousted in 2016, James Todd. I can't remember off the top of my head who Cindy Holscher's running against, but her district has a little bit of Olathe in it, along with Overland Park. And I'm fascinated to see if these are districts that are starting to become Democratic districts, or if they're going to revert back to that, 2016 or Republican-held districts, because, people ran so much against Brown back in 2016. This will be an interesting sign of, okay, in a general election, are people, are some of these districts in the suburban area really kind of finally becoming Democratic?
Yeah, those will be too. And also in your area, is Steve Becker, is he going to run a write-in campaign?
No, I don't believe so. There are two House races that are interesting because the 111th in Hayes and then the 72nd in Newton. And they've been, Republicans have won them, Democrats have won them. Currently, both of them have Democrats in office. They each have a really strong Republican challenger. And so it will be interesting to see if the Democrats hold those seats. But the Democrat in North Newton, Representative Tim Hodge, he goes out every night armed with voter registration forms. His idea is if he can get 2,500 new voters, he'll win, because they'll likely be supporting him. So when he knocks on the door, he'll say, go get your driver's license, and then he gets the number. And then he takes a picture, and it shows up on Facebook. And I think he's just going to try to win by getting more, by expanding his base.
Mm-hmm. And I will note one thing about, you said that was Tim Hodge, right, Mary? So in that survey of folks I did, Democrat, Republican, are you supporting your party nominee, Tim Hodge was the only Democrat who flat out would not tell me whether he'd support Laura Kelly.
Well, he said when he goes to, knocks on the door, he says, I know you think I'm in the wrong party. So he knows that for a Democrat to win, it's tough. So
Okay. I have one final question, then we'll open it up to your questions and answers. And my final question is hopefully a relatively easy one. We have a lot of students here tonight. Many of them are studying journalism and contemplating a career in journalism. What advice would you give them about going into journalism? Either positives or things that they should, just take into account as they pursue that career?
Well, I'm what's considered an MMJ, a multimedia journalist, so I do everything from run the camera during my interviews to write my script to edit my stories to send it to broadcast, usually all by myself, usually from a laptop, usually from the passenger seat of my Ford Escape.
It's amazing, too, to watch.
Thank you. So my advice for students is learn as much as you can. Build that arsenal. And you don't have to be 100% incredible, awesome at everything, but come out so when you go look to your first interview, you can say, not only am I a reporter with a great broadcast reel or a great print portfolio, but I can also edit video from my phone and send it to Twitter. I can do a social stand-up without having half of my arm in it. And I can also start building stuff for the web to drive content, not only from our paper product or our television product, but onto the web as well. So take this opportunity to learn as much as you can. If you can go to journalism conferences, try and find a way. I know that some of them offer scholarships or some half funding. Make connections and just build your arsenal, because that is the way, at least in broadcast, that things are going. MMJs are going to be the future.
We've had
Thinking about
a
this.
number of layoffs at the Hutchinson News and other newspapers. That said, I love my job. So if somebody in college wants to work in a newspaper, I say that's worth pursuing. And it may mean you take an internship and you agree not to be paid anything while you're going to college. But just because you see layoffs at newspapers shouldn't be a reason not to give it a shot.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking about this a lot because I think 8 years ago I was leaving high school and I was knocking on doors as like a door-to-door canvasser for a home remodeling company, and now I'm interviewing governors of states, and it's kind of wild. Let me just say this straight off. This is the best job in the world to me. I love what I do, and I can't imagine doing anything else, even though the time might come where I do have to do something else, and that will probably break my heart, but for now I love this. And I kind of feel like I'm a professional athlete. One day I might tear my ACL, but man, I love being part of the Kansas City Royals.
Look, you picked the Royals of all seasons. You chose the Royals in this analogy.
We have to go home. We have to go hometown.
These are Jayhawk people. You stick with them.
I think that's the big thing is, so I have this Honda Civic that I've driven to almost every reporting assignment I've ever been on for over the last 7 years, and this has been, being a journalist, especially in 2018, is the adventure of a lifetime, and I can't imagine, doing anything else. And I think to the people considering getting into this, sure, things are murky. The Star, I adore the paper I work for. I love writing for it, and I love the people I work with. I think there have been 4 rounds of layoffs since I've gotten there 2.5 years ago. And that breaks my heart. But I go in there every day, and I just adore the people I work with. And we're all a little bit crazy, and we all didn't get enough sleep. And man, we drank too much coffee, but we love what we do. And again, I've met so many fascinating people in this time. You interview World War II veterans, you interview people who, have just overcome huge obstacles in life. You interview fascinating politicians. And anybody who wants to do this, I just say, read everything, talk to everybody. And man, I talked to somebody once who was like, you can't have any fear. I'm scared all the time. Let me be clear. Especially, if you really want to fret. You interview lawmakers in the Kansas legislature who, carry concealed handguns, so you can kind of be afraid sometimes. But I'm always afraid kind of just when I go out, but that fear kind of motivates me to talk to everybody and just go out and, I love this. So if you love this, just do it. Just go out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you care about your country, if you care about your community, if you care about your state, and you want something that will will hold your interest day in and day out. There's just no better thing to do. It's been a total privilege. My first legislative session was 1982. I was the State House reporter for what was then KANU, now KPR. And the people who I've had a privilege to meet throughout those years, I mean, I see Dave Ranney in the back of the room here, one of the best reporters this state has ever known, for the Eagle, for the Journal World. It's truly a privilege, and I think that's the thing. If you feel that, and if you understand that going in, there's no better thing to do. If you're doing it simply, I mean, for other reasons, and you want to just use it as a stepping stone to PR, then I might advise against it.
Yeah.
Well, seriously, I mean, that's not a criticism. It's just kind of, you have to have a passion for it, as Hunter was talking about. But I've had a chance. I spent a week on the bus with John McCain when he was in South Carolina. The Capital Journal, the Morris papers, we all had to write a profile of one of the presidential candidates, and I lucked out, and they sent me. And what a fun experience that was. You know, I covered Senator Dole in his heyday. I've covered, you know, multiple governors Carlin, Hayden, Finney, Graves, and I don't regret a minute of it. So if you feel that connection to your community, to your country, to your state, and to the people around you, and you want to do a service for them, no better thing to do.
Okay, I have about 20 minutes for questions. Now, most of you have been here before. You know, we have basically two requests. One, ask one question. Okay, don't say, here's question one, here's question two, question three. We don't hear after question one. And make question one brief, okay? This is an opportunity for as many people to ask questions as possible, not for people to give statements. So if you have a question, raise your hand. One of the students will come by and give you a shot, and we'll get as many in as we can in the time we have allowed.
Yeah, I would just like to ask any of you to comment on people's concerns that their vote in Kansas may not be recorded correctly.
Don't all of you jump in at once.
Well, I'm thinking about that. I think I understand the reason for that question. And I think it probably has to do maybe with the person who runs the Secretary of State's office now. And I'm not sure how fair that is. I mean, the elections in Kansas are administered by county election officials, you know, all over the state, and I've met plenty of them, and they take it very seriously. Now, going back to what I said before, the election officials in Sedgwick, Johnson, Shawnee are all appointed by the Secretary of State. I think people, as knowing what I know at this moment, I think people should have confidence in this state.
And I'll say, I went to an election conference at Harvard, talking to folks who cover, you know, elections and essentially the hardware of it. And one great suggestion was, you know, as a reporter, should go through poll worker training, and that's
Right.
great. I didn't get to do it for the primary. I'm doing it for the general, and I think for anybody who is skeptical and concerned about their election, again, like Jim said, it really, you know, it's at the county level this happens. Go volunteer, be a poll worker, see how it goes. I mean, if you have a problem with your car, you want to understand what's wrong with your car. Go and just go to your county election official, say, here's my concern, and you just have that conversation. And I think volunteer to be a poll worker, see how that goes, see how much goes into this.
I will say, though, if you've been following these recent meetings of the Objections Board, that seems not to be a great process to me.
Yeah, it's,
I mean, seriously, I mean, it just seems, for whoever goes in there with a complaint, it feels to me like the deck is stacked right off the bat, and we'll have to see how that plays out over time, because I don't think we're done with that.
Okay, let's go on to the next question. I want to move very quickly, so who else is working mics? Haley?
We just have one microphone for tonight.
Oh, just one microphone?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
As a former reporter at both the statewide and local levels, I found the most difficult thing in political reporting was to cover the unspoken truths. And by that I mean it could be character issues that they don't want to discuss about whether it's the candidate's a drunk or a womanizer, but nowadays it's also often race or ethnicity. People won't talk about it, yet it is clearly an underlying theme in races. You see that?
Yeah, I actually think that's a great observation. That is, it's hard to get at that. And that's why you see so much horse race coverage, because it's easier. But I think you're right. I think you're seeing it particularly, listen, back to that journalism question and back to your point, I think we're living in another golden age. I mean, that newspaper war between the Post and the Times that has been touched off by this administration is really amazing to watch. And I think you're seeing a lot of that more nuanced coverage at the national level, but it is much harder to do. And you know from being a reporter that one of the primary skills is you have to make people comfortable talking to you. And then you don't want to exploit that when they do. So there is a balance there, but I would totally agree with you. I think that's harder to get at, but very important that we do.
Okay, next question. I'm going to move very quickly, so.
Thanks, Bill. Hi, I'm Mark Johnson. I practice law in Kansas City, and I teach in the journalism school and the law school here as well. The question I have is, have any of you detected any possible effect in any of the races with the recently liberalized voter registration rules in Kansas?
Have we detected an effect?
Well, I think one would be with these, well, like the 72nd district, where as Hodge is going out getting people signed up, he doesn't have to ask for their birth certificate.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that's actually going to end up being a potentially significant factor in this election, because that makes it easier to get people registered.
I think we're going to see more and more people come out to register because they're comfortable not feeling like they're under attack for trying to exercise their most basic American right.
I'm going to take it in a little bit of a different direction. Mark, I think you'll appreciate this. In the chaos right after there was that week where Kobach and Collier wasn't clear who had won, I'd asked Kobach's campaign, are you concerned at all that there was any voter fraud in the primary? And, because he obviously the proof of citizenship, bit of the voter ID law was struck down by Judge Julie Robinson. And, he had been concerned about voter fraud. And there was a statement from the campaigner, I believe it was from Chris, saying, we don't know how many, people could have voted. And then, gosh, I think it was about 2 weeks after the election, I followed up and I said, well, you're still concerned about voter fraud now that you won? And his answer was that it was too short of a time period for people who could have voted illegally to register. And I thought that was an interesting answer. So I will say Kobach's, and I had a reader email me and get mad about this. I had said it was Kobach's supposed claims of voter fraud because he has been able to prove small doses, but not the large, 3 million people voting illegally in the presidential election that he's claimed. I think that'll be the key thing with this. I mean, is he going to use it to say there are a lot of people voting illegally, and will he be able to prove it?
Okay, next question.
I'm not asking about the changes in your own organizations, but I'm curious to know if you think the public is being served as well through the media in this election as it had been in past elections when the media was a little more robust.
I would say no. I think that you've seen, just in recent years, corporations come in and buy family-owned newspapers, and so that shrinks. You end up with smaller staffs and a lot of shared stories between papers, and it just you just have fewer people watching the system, and I think that that's regrettable.
Well, I think obviously there are fewer people watching the system. Journalism jobs have gone down, but I look at the political team I work with at the Star, and I mean, we are working out of our mind, and we love our job. So I don't, sure, we might not be covering everything that we used to, back in the 90s. We're not covering every city council meeting, but I think in this big picture coverage, like the governor's race with the congressional races, I think journalists are feeling bolder. I mean, I wake up and the president of the United States is calling me an enemy of the people. And I mean, somehow that motivates me just to work harder to win people's trust. I mean, I want all my readers to trust me, and I'm working even harder than I think, and again, I'm young, I wasn't doing this in the 90s, clearly, I'd just been born. But
we won't hold that against you.
But I think some of that trust was taken for granted. I mean, I am working every day for you all to trust me, and if you don't trust me, I want you to call me and tell me and tell me why. I want to have that conversation.
have a little bit of a quick nuanced answer. I think the answer is yes and no. I mean, I think at the national level, I think the coverage that we're getting right now is as good as it's ever been. I think at the statewide level, I think Hunter's right. I've been around bigger state house press corps. This is smaller, but I think the quality of the reporters are just as good as they've ever been, notwithstanding the fact that certain giants like Lou Ferguson are no longer with us. But having said that, I think at the local level, back to Mary's point, the local newspaper that's focused on the local news in Hutchinson or in Hayes or in Garden City, I think that's where we're seeing the deficit at the moment because of smaller staffs, homogenization, newspaper chains buying up, and you don't have that local flavor anymore. So I think it's kind of a yes and no answer. The last thing I'd say there is the multi-platform stuff. I'm doing more now. The Kansas News Service, every story that I do airs in Wichita, Kansas City, Garden City, Hutchinson, Pittsburgh, and Lawrence. And we did that purposefully. Back when I was working at KANU, there was no cooperation like that. So I think that serves the public pretty well, frankly.
Broadcast is a different beast than radio and print. Obviously, we have a different kind of model in how we talk to and convey the news. But I am a Kansan. I was born and raised here. I'm a K-State grad. I've never been more proud than when I'm standing in a group of reporters like the reporters we have here, and we're asking questions to make sure that the state where I grew up and the state that made me who I am is just as good as it needs to be for every one of our viewers. So I think that, yes, we are seeing massive changes, and the way that I have to get that news out there is totally different than it was even 5 years ago. But I think, feel free to stand with us. You'll see we're not holding anything back.
Okay, next question.
I hate to ask this question.
Yeah, no, you don't.
But how can I sit through an hour-long discussion of Kansas politics and not hear the word abortion? What's happened to it as an issue? I mean, it used to dominate the races, and you haven't heard it at all.
But it still does, Dave. But it dominates in a different way. I mean, it's just it's a litmus test for entry into the political arena, and then you're done with it. Yeah. You can't get in. You can't run if you're a Republican in places like Wichita. If you just can't. And by the way, this is the second episode of the podcast. It's all about the protests in Wichita in 1991. And as being the triggering event in terms of where we are today in Kansas politics. And I think it's I think it's still a huge issue. And it was certainly an issue, Dave, in the Democratic primary this year between Laura Kelly and Josh Spotty. It was very much an issue in that race, a decisive issue, I would think.
When Greg Orman took his 20 minutes on the Stumpin' for Votes at the State Fair Saturday, he received the only question that was asked for the whole day on abortion. Mm-hmm. And the person who asked it wasn't pleased with his answer because he said he wants to focus on the root causes, or he didn't give a clear answer on that. But that was the only time that issue ever came up.
Just for the record, I pressed him on that in an interview the other day. Depending on what happens with Roe v. Wade and the case that's now before the Kansas Supreme Court, whether he would sign a bill to make abortion illegal again in Kansas. And he said he absolutely will not go back to those days where women are having unsafe abortions unsaid. So you have to push him, but that's what he said.
Okay, next question.
Hi. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on how having contested Democratic primaries in congressional districts like District 3, where that's not always the norm, affected the unaffiliated voter turnout in the Republican primaries, particularly in districts where we're seeing incumbent moderate Republicans not winning their primaries?
I think where you're going with that question is there was real excitement that a Democratic primary and unaffiliated voters registered Democratic to vote in that race because it was getting all the headlines, and how that affect the turnout then maybe in some of those Republican primaries where moderates lost. And I don't know, but what I understand, and I have not looked into this very deeply, but what I understand is some of those moderates who lost got essentially the same vote total they got when they won. So I think it was the other way around. I think the contested gubernatorial race between Collier and Kobach motivated more conservatives to come out, and I think that was the difference maker in some of those races. But it's just a guess.
Yeah.
Okay, next question.
This will be short. It can be a yes or no question, I think. Oh, I'm holding your hand. This can be a yes or no question. And that is there any way that the Orman candidacy can hurt anyone but Laura Kelly? Is it absolutely certain that he cannot touch Kobach's performance, yes or no?
Is it, so it's a,
Can he hurt Kobach's performance and vote getting, or is the only candidate Orman can hurt is Laura Kelly?
I'm not discounting that he could have an impact on Kobach's campaign and the Kobach's voter turnout, absolutely. I think that's what makes him a formidable concern for both. Now, would they be exactly the same impact versus Laura Kelly and Chris Kobach? I don't think so, but I think what we're seeing, especially when we look at the primary numbers, and I'm going to keep going back to this Jim Barnett and this Ken Selzer votes, is that anything could really tap into voters, and I think, yes, I think he could impact both.
Any other comments? Okay, next question.
Hi, I was wondering in the gubernatorial CD2 and 3 if you think President Trump will have an impact, how big of an impact he'll have in those races, and whether it will hurt or help the Republican candidate.
Well, you look at, President Trump tweeted about Kobach on, the day before the election, and Kobach won by 343 votes. Do you think Trump made up, could have counted for 343 votes? I certainly think so. Obviously, there's no way to prove that. I get the impression Trump is going to come for Kobach at some point, and I imagine, if that's in the 3rd district, that could involve Yoder. If it's in the 2nd, it could definitely involve Steve Watkins. And again, in a district like the 3rd, I'm not sure how it would help Yoder, because he's trying to kind of strike this centrist vibe right now. Steve Watkins is kind of trying to mold himself in that kind of Trump, outsider thing. He would think it would help him, but I think Paul Davis could pretty well defend a Trump visit. Though Paul has been really interesting how he's approached Trump, because I covered, he actually spoke here at KU with Jason Kander to some college students, I believe it was last Thursday, and he didn't really directly criticize Trump. He criticized Betsy DeVos implicitly, and then he criticized something about the Trump administration, but he hasn't really gone after Trump. So Paul's been interesting about how he's handled Trump in a district that obviously has Lawrence, has Topeka, but then has like Atchison and other areas like that.
I think the question that I find more fascinating is when Trump's endorsement comes and how that impacts the voters and how they're thinking. Because there was discussion that the president wanted to endorse Kobach several weeks previously, but there was some discussion within the White House. Is that appropriate at this time, or do we need to wait? So we saw this kind of last minute endorsement that may have shifted some voters who weren't sure about Kobach to go. But remember, his base is very strong. So the presidential endorsement isn't going to do anything more for the base than just make them want to vote more than once. So I think, which I don't know how the Secretary of State would feel about that. But I think for me, I'm waiting to see how far in the timeline the presidential endorsements come.
I think Yoder wishes Trump would not come.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Trump helps him at all in that district. I think he's got those votes already, and I think that he's, again, Trump lost that district, albeit by 1%, but my guess is if that vote were held today, it would be a bigger margin. Watkins is counting on the fact that Trump won the 2nd district big, okay, and so Watkins already kind of said that he put out a mailer that with his picture with the hat on and Trump on the front of it, like a quasi-endorsement, even though the president didn't endorse him, but he certainly is campaigning as if he wants it.
I think the most visual thing about how Representative Yoder is feeling about having the Trump administration near his district is when Vice President Mike Pence came, Yoder stayed in Washington, D.C. I mean, there were other elected officials that were there. Josh Hawley came sprinting up on stage, both at the vice president's visit and at the president's visit. So he stayed in Washington. He said he had votes, but he did stay in Washington.
Pence said nice things about him, but he wasn't in the room.
Yeah, he was not in the room.
Okay, let's go to our final question.
So if Kobach wins, what are the odds that he gets his agenda through the legislature? Pretty strong, I presume.
That he gets what through the legislature?
His agenda through the legislature.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that's the case. I mean, so when you looked at, when I keep going back to that story from today with the division within the Kansas GOP, a lot of those folks I talked to, they won their primaries, they're already in office, and, if they don't win the general, either, a Democrat would win. So that apprehension amongst the moderates is there. Those moderates, again, you essentially already have, it might be a slightly more conservative House, but you still have a base of moderates who, they won't tell me they're going to oppose Kobach, but I know there was one moderate who tried to get Kobach to pay, pass a budget amendment that said Kobach had to pay his own court fines when he gets fined in court. So people are unhappy with Kobach. He's coming in with baggage.
That day, the vote in the House on that amendment, 6 people voted against it.
I think
only 6 members of the House voted.
I think like 100 people voted for it, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
It was an overwhelming amount.
It's easier to stop something than it is to get something through. So if you do have a functioning coalition under a Kobach with moderate Republicans and Democrats, then it's easier to stop things from happening. So I don't know. I think it'll be still there'll still be a healthy coalition of people who will be skeptical of some of the things he might propose.
And Kobach has really done nothing to get mods on his side. And, he's not for Medicaid expansion. He wants to reverse the tax cuts, or the tax increase. A lot of moderates really kind of fell on their sword for. So I'm not sure how moderates kind of get into the Kobach camps. There would have to be some change from both of them.
Okay, I'm going to thank our panelists and ask you to join me in thanking them for our discussion tonight.
And Bill, I should have thanked you and the Dole Institute. This was a pleasure, and I really enjoyed the people at dinner too. Thank you.
And I want to let everybody know that next Tuesday night we'll be having our annual Constitution Day program. It will focus on the 150th Amendment. The 150th, 150th, a little bit in the future. I'm getting my verbiage, 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment. And then for those of you who believe, like I hope there are many of you, that the country has become too polarized and that we become too separated, we will have the inaugural Ed Riley lecture on October 4th, featuring Rob Robertson, who is a regional representative from Better Angels, which is working to try to mend the gap between red and blue in our country. So thank you very much for your support of the Institute. Thanks for coming out. We'll see you maybe next week. Thank you.